Okay, so I'm going to be talking about while loops in Python. So loops in programming in general is a way to rerun a section of code over and over again. A while loop is essentially while a given condition equates to true, we run some code. So the code that I've written here, as you can see, it says while true print high. So what this means is this is going to run constantly. It's going to run indefinitely because true is always a truthy value. True is always it's one. It's a true boolean. So if I run this, you'll see on the bottom here we've got high running over and over again. So I'm going to cancel that, and if I scroll up, you'll see this run thousands and thousands of times. There, it's very quick. So instead of passing it true directly, we can pass it a condition, and whether that equates to true or not will determine whether it runs. So as an example of this, I can say I equals 0. So we've got an integer that is the value of 0, and then I can say while I is less than 10, and this time we're going to print the integer I itself. So running this, we'll see once again it's doing the same thing where it's running over and over again repeatedly, and that's because we're getting 0 every time, because that is the current value of I as it's declared up here. And because I isn't changing, this is always a true statement. To help visualize this, sometimes it can help to kind of like just imagine some brackets, some parentheses around there, and you can see that whatever is within here, if this equates to a true boolean, then that means the while loop will continue to run. So again, if that's still not really quite clear, think about an if statement. So if 1 equals 1, then print, I don't know, 1. This would run, because when we say if, we then give it a condition. So does the integer 1, is that equal to the integer 1? Yes, it is. So we'll run this code. So this would print 1. So it's the exact same situation here. So since I, the integer 0, is smaller than 10, this is running. So how do we stop this from running automatically? Well, using the code within the while block, we can essentially manipulate the condition to no longer have it be true. So in this case, a good way to do it would be to take the value of I, and then we can assign it to itself plus 1. So what this will do is every single loop, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to print the value of I, so we can see it down here in the console. And then we're going to take the value of I, and we're going to add 1 to its current value and assign that back to it. So when I run this, you'll see we have the number, the integer 0, which is what it began at, and then we are incrementing up by 1 every single iteration. So every single time a loop does another pass of its own code, we call that an iteration of a loop. So this iterates from 0 through to 9, and then the next time it tried to run, it said, right, is I less than 10? And because after we printed 9 here, we then incremented it once more, this means that I is now equal to 10. So this is no longer true, this is now false. And while a condition is false, it will not run. You'll see here what's really good about the syntax highlighting in VS Code is when I set this to false, these went a slightly transparent color. They're a lot fainter. And that's a good way for us to see whether it's going to run at face value. And this won't always work, especially for like conditions like this, but when it's a very clear indicator where we are literally passing it the Boolean false and it knows it won't run, VS Code is helping me out with that little type hint. So that's really cool. So that's the basic essence of how a while loop works, but it can do some other things as well. So for example, there is the continue statement. And this applies to all types of loops in Python, but within a loop itself, you have access to some extra functions. So one of them is continue. And I say a function, but it doesn't have the parentheses at the end. You just use the keyword continue on its own. And then you have break. So continue will skip the rest of the current iteration. And this will, and break will break the loop and progress onwards with executing your code. So continue will essentially end the current iteration and begin the next one, and break, regardless of what's happening, will essentially override the condition given to while. And while will get out of the way, it'll stop, and we'll move on to whatever's after it. So to illustrate this, I'm going to use our I integer again. So I'm going to say while I is less than 10. So doing exactly what we were doing before. And I'm going to get rid of these now. So we'll say while I is less than 10 first. Once again, we're going to print I, and then we're going to increment the number once more. And this time, instead of doing I equals I plus 1, because that's a little bit heavy, it's a little bit, we can do it a nicer way. We can do I plus equals 1. And this is just a nice way to add something to the current value of a variable. So this will add 1 to the current value of I and save it back into the I variable. So yes, we are printing I, we are incrementing it by 1, and now we're going to do an if statement. We're going to say if I equals 3, break. So this is essentially, this here is exactly what we had last time, just with this shorthand version of incrementing I. But now we've got this check down here. So if I equals 3, break. And instead of seeing us go from 0 to 9, what we would expect now is for us to go from 0 to 2. Yeah, we increment it after we print it. So it should go 0, 1, 2. And then this will set the variable I to the number 3. This check will become true, and we're going to break the loop and move on. And then I'm going to say loop is done. So once the loop stops, we'll know that because it will say loop is done. So we run this, 0, 1, 2, and the loop is done. Even though this was still true, break will always break the flow of execution and move us on from the current loop. If you have a nested loop, and by that I mean if you have a loop within this loop, calling break will only break the current one. So if we had a while loop within a while loop, calling break will only break the current level of the loop. Okay. Now, the continue statement that I mentioned before, that's where we can skip an iteration. So I'm going to remove this break from the end, and instead, above our print, I'm going to say if I equals, let's say 4, then continue. So what this should do is once I equals the value 4, and this is true, we're going to run this continue statement. And that is going to skip the remainder of this iteration on the loop. So instead of then going down to do this code, we're going to start again. What I am going to have to do here, so this is going to cause an infinite loop, because then once I is equal to 4, we're just going to run this over and over again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the first thing we do in the loop is increment the number. And that way, when we have I equal to 4, we're not going to print it, but we can still continue iterating the number. So you've always got to think about that flow of execution, because you don't want to be stuck in an infinite loop, because then your code will just stop whatever it's doing and it will get stuck, it will hang there. So when I run this, it goes 1, 2, 3, 5. 1, 2, 3, 5. And you'll also notice it doesn't start from 0 now, and that's because we are iterating the number first before we ever print it. So that's why we're starting from 1. But 1, 2, 3, 5. And that's because as soon as I was equal to 4, this continue statement kicked in. And finally, the last thing to know about a loop is the else statement. So similar to what you've probably used is we have an if statement. If I equals 0, do this. And then we have else, do that. So that's kind of your typical if statement. We can do that with a loop as well. So right after the while loop, so on the same level of nesting here, we can go else, and then we can print, actually let's bring this up here. Let's print loop is done, and then we'll print back to main flow of execution. So if I run this code, you'll see that all of this continues as normal. Our skip of the integer 4 is still happening, and then at the end, we're seeing loop is done. So this code is taking place immediately after the while loop has concluded, and that's because it is down here straight after it. and then we're back to the main flow of execution. So this specific feature of a while loop is a little bit rare to see, because it's not commonly super useful, because what you might be thinking is, well, this is running after the loop, but this is also running after the loop. So that kind of introduces this situation where it doesn't always make sense to use else statements at the end. Unless what you're doing here is very relevant to the while loop or some other nuanced situation, depending on what it is you're making, you generally won't see this, but it is a feature nonetheless, so it's worth knowing about. And that pretty much covers everything that while loops can do at a basic level within Python.